Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday morning. Explicit Measures Podcast. We're doing episode 22 around DAX. I think this is going to be a very loaded topic. But before we jump into DAX, we have a little bit of an intro here going on. There is some really interesting release plan items for Power BI coming out. So Microsoft just released the 2021 release plan, Wave 2, kind of outlining the next chunk of work or feature sets that are going to be exposed as they develop Power BI. So let's jump in there. Tommy, we have read through the release plan, or some of us have, all the way. Some of us have not. Some of us are kind of picking up as we go. And of the features that are coming out, are there any specific things that you're really excited about coming out in the next wave?
Well, there's a lot of things I'm always excited about when these things come out, but there's by far one that I cannot wait for December. It is let me know if you guys read it too, and if I'm reading this right, because I may be getting excited over something I'm just might have misread. So it's the artifact level access for Power BI apps, which from what I understood is saying you can create multiple apps in a workspace.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, good. I want to make sure it's like, no, Tommy, that's not what it said.
I think that's how it reads.
I'm pretty sure how it reads.
Yep. So this has been a complaint and or challenge, I think, for a number of years where you build 5 reports and you have an audience or different audiences, right? You may have a finance team, an HR team, an executive team, and they need to see different reports, right? But you don't want to manage multiple workspaces. So up until this point, until this feature is released, our guidance has been, if you have a different audience, you need to make an app. And if you're going to make an app, you need to make multiple workspaces to support each audience. So if you have, 3 audiences there for those 5 reports, you've got to figure out ways of publishing those different reports for each of the audiences into different workspaces. It just makes more management on the Power BI side.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a pain.
So hopefully they're not bringing back content packs, because that's technically what a content pack was. Hopefully it looks like they're enhancing the experience for an app too, which I think is, hopefully they put a little more time in that, just because, this is a huge one for me.
Awesome.
December 2021 public preview.
Public preview in December of 2021. That looks like a good one. I will actually, now that you mentioned that, I will drop the link for that one directly in the chat window as well. So here is the let's call this is the Power BI apps. And you said that initially, and I thought Power Apps when you said that, but it's actually a Power BI app. There's too many
Power BI app.
There's too many apps.
There's too many words and terms that they're throwing around nowadays.
Too many flows and too many apps.
Mm-hmm. Seth, is there any features that you plucked out of here?
I got 2, man. So I'm gonna follow you.
Okay.
Because we can only pick one, and I think one of them is the one you're gonna pick.
Well,
you go first.
So, so there's a couple that I'm kind of torn on here, and we've actually been harping on one of these for quite a while.
So you're in the same boat as I am.
I think so.
I get it.
I think we're kind of in the same boat here.
You're trying to make me go first.
Well, I was giving you the opportunity. So I think one thing that's going to be pretty pivotal here will be the export to Excel improvements for table and matrix visuals. I tell people all the time, table and matrix are yes, they're good, they're valuable, but you are not looking at 6 million rows in a table. You're just not doing it. There's other things. We should be aggregating this data to some higher level, and I really try and push people to Excel. Using a data model in Excel seems to be like the right approach. Like, I feel like that's what you really want when you're getting into these large tables of things. So that being said, people will always want to have tables in Power BI, and people will always want to export them at high volumes of data. I don't know why. It just seems to be part of BI reporting in general. When I was working in business objects, that's what we did. We did not build any visuals. We just built tables of data and then exported them and then shaped it and did additional shaping on our own. So whatever, it is what it is. But I think a lot of people are going to ask for that feature, and that's October 2021. So that's another one that I think is kind of going to be a bigger play here.
So that's retaining the format
Correct.
of a table,
Yes.
not improving any.
Table.
I didn't read any.
No,
I didn't read any. We're going to increase the output.
Yes. And one thing I'll note though on this one, if you read the release plan, and I'll link to the overview of the release plan for people to kind of catch it. So here's the full release plan. Copy that, drop that in the chat window. And then I'm also going to drop in the export to Excel feature here. So I'll throw that in there as well. Export to Excel. If you look at this, and at the bottom, they have this area. Thank you for your idea. And we've been very vocal as the ideas website has not quite been the best experience. And I think you're seeing Microsoft directly refer to that and be like, hey, look, we are listening and these features are being released. And a lot of these features are directly in line with ideas that have been on the ideas site for quite a while. So I believe the ideas from the idea page for this one was built on 7/12/2016.
We're still looking. Guys, when are we gonna talk about tables as visual for a topic? Because I feel like we're skirting around that.
Alex Powers goes, sheesh.
Let's not. I'm in a good mood, Tommy.
Okay.
Let's talk about the good stuff.
It's coming.
So
it's coming.
I'm gonna pick one that I'm most excited about seeing. One, since I can only pick one, I'm not gonna drop multiple.
Yeah.
But we've talked about one at length about how excited we are. But I am very interested and excited to see what comes out of the natural language to DAX generation. Like,
really?
I think that was a teaser.
Yep.
That we saw a while ago, and like there's a little bit more detail, in the roadmap here.
Yep.
But I'm telling you, like, to the topic today, right? This dovetails to it as well, and it wasn't obviously planned, but at the same time, like, we're gonna talk about the struggles of learning DAX and pointers for people in our journeys and why we make the recommendations that we do, because it's not easy, right? And if they've figured out a way to leverage AI to make recommendations, and there's several patterns that they're displaying to the end user and potentially showing them examples, like that could go a long way in a lot heavier adoption or more Power BI folks, for sure. Because I think if there's one stumbling block that hits people right upside the head, it's after the first simple calculation. They try to dive deep into the deep end, and they don't know they're diving into the deep end.
Yeah, I would agree
So
with that.
That's the one I'm most excited to see from a roadmap perspective.
Are you excited or like anticipating?
Hey man, you gotta shoot for the stars. Highly hope it's a fantastic feature that's useful. But it certainly seems like it's not like it. Whether that's a help text kind of, I can select some of sales group by, or show me this over time, or it's a much better experience than the help measures that we have right now.
So if you think about at a core level of what's going on here, right? I'm very, very, very abstract level. Microsoft is hosting millions of Power BI files, millions of DAX calculations.
Yeah, they see
millions of patterns. Like so there is so much information that they have in the wheelhouse somewhere where they could look at analytics on how people are writing things. What percentage of all DAX calculations have variables in them? Right? Like, I'm writing variables all the stinking time whenever I write stuff, all the time, especially when I'm using like the selected value features. Like, you can literally go across models and say which one of these things should be using variables. So there's probably like a boat ton of analytics that could help inform a lot of these things. So it'll be interesting to see where this one goes. Of all the AI and natural language generation things that Microsoft is doing, of all the feature sets, they're cool, they're great demo items, but I very rarely use them. So this is one of these I'm holding my breath on this one because it could be really interesting if they can bundle up a Marco Russo and stick them in a AI algorithm. I
And a
think everyone will
clipper.
love it. Everyone will love it. But what happens when this thing starts producing stuff that you don't understand?
hmm
And so you just now start
Well,
blindly
and that's
following it.
so it could go one of two ways.
Yeah.
Right. It could, if it's natural language and I start asking questions like, are you requiring keywords the same way that, we have to build in the model? Is there a manual step to get to where we need to be?
Yep.
Potentially, even to your point, Tommy, like even last episode, you talked about using VS Code as a repository for measure information.
Yep.
Well, is this an extension of that, or is it like just the full blown solution? Either way, it remains to be seen. Something that big for such a challenging area within the tool, I'm always excited about. So if people haven't checked out the roadmap, this is the roadmap, right?
Yeah.
You want to see what's coming down the pipe in Power BI and where they're investing and spending time.
Yep.
This is it.
So book your calendar because February 2022, we already have an episode because that's when this is coming out.
Is it going to be tables or is it gonna be...
Exactly.
Oh, that's
all right. So this actually is a great lead-in because not only do we love DAX in general, but you write it all the time, and so this is kind of be a conversation around how did you start learning DAX? What resources did you start with? What do you wish you knew earlier? What do we do now and as we learn DAX today? So what tools we're using now that we're and also I think as I've looked at this, right, we've been around this community pretty much since it started. And then DAX initially, there wasn't a lot of materials out there. I think there was the Power BI community which was kind of good. There was a number of books that were out there from very large companies. I guess SQL BI being one of them was really solid. Phil Seamark, I read his book, a very close
Rob
friend of
Colley.
ours. Yep, Rob Colley was another good one. So I think there's a lot of a couple resources out there, but they're all in book form. And I feel like now there's a lot more online DAX sources and help that can it's changed, right? The knowledge of the entire community has gotten better, and from that, it's easier to find answers now than ever before. So with that, let's kick off. Tommy, maybe give us some of your initial. How did you start learning practices? Like what did you do in the beginning?
So I love that this is our topic today, just because for those who have learned DAX or are in that process, DAX to me is one of the most deceiving functional languages to learn because it is also one of the more simple ones to learn. If you ever try to learn SQL or R or Python, usually that's the beginning stage is always the hardest to kind of get the mindset on how it works, the functions to use, the structure of the code or the language. DAX is not that. It's, hey, this is very similar to Excel. The sum
Yep.
or, filter's pretty straightforward. Take
Yep.
a table, filter based on a value. But that's what makes it, again, very deceiving is because unlike other languages where the mindset you're changing or adapting to is the language, with DAX, your mindset's changing is the output. The
Yes.
fact that certain fields and visuals will show a different number based on the context, that's a tough thing to kind of understand the first time or comprehend. Even so, and it's doing exactly what you want it to do.
Yes.
Or what you're telling it to do. And I think that's the hardest part with DAX is someone can get into it, write a sum year to date. That's, again, it's pretty straightforward especially if you worked in Excel for a while. But again, it's all about the output and what's actually going to show. So to me, that's the very unique part of learning DAX. And so getting into DAX, it was, there's a language. Obviously, when Power BI Designer came out, it's total sales. So cool. That's easy. A year to date is pretty easy. I really wish I could find my old reports, like my first 5 reports
you don't.
I ever
You do
made.
not wish that.
No, I do.
No one wishes that on you, Tommy. You would cry.
I'm not going to share them.
No.
That's like watching a video of you in college going, oh, gosh.
What the heck was I doing?
Yeah, what was I doing? Yeah, exactly.
Why did I have a bowl cut?
What a punk. Yeah, kind of, yeah. So, right, yeah. Shave, man. Yeah, that's what I would have told
right,
myself.
exactly.
But it's the same thing, because just to see, like, how did I go about it? Probably a lot of implicit measures, but
Oh
we'll go
yeah.
into that. But yeah, but to me, that's what I'm really excited about for just because, and that's always the process. Anything new we're learning in DAX, even today,
Yep.
for someone who's been doing it for years, if you have a new scenario or a new situation, that a new business objective, it's kind of understanding that context and what the output's going to be.
So I think you bring up some really good points there, and I'm going to drop in something that I felt has fit my learning path very closely. This is SQL Gene, and his his blog article is "Why DAX is a PTA, Part 1." so this is a great article. There's an image at the top of this article. It's linked in the chat window. So it starts talking about the learning curve, and so I felt like this. It starts talking about what functionality you learn versus the difficulty of that functionality. So I came from an Excel world. So a lot of the functions like sum, average, those scalar functions, those just general ones, they're straight out of Excel. And so you're very easily it's very easy adoption in that first knowledge area of DAX. And then immediately you have needs to do time intelligence. And if you look at SQL Gene's curve, time intelligence is very far up the curve. You have to understand evaluation contexts or filter context and how to do that with time intelligence.
Mm.
And so I was constantly in this lower range of calculated columns and measures, which I kind of understood, but then I have to jump up this curve into this very difficult time intelligence part. And I think time intelligence was a struggle I had for a long time. And now I that's kind of been not as much of an issue anymore because I've spent time learning it. So I think that's a really good representation. One more thing I'll point out here is, Tommy, you said about like coming from the Excel space. I think DAX is a merge of 3 different languages. So if you look at the functions that are inside DAX, you have a lot of Excel functions, sums, averages. That feels just like Excel. You also have a lot of things like SQL. There's a lot of functions that come straight out of SQL language. And then if you also look at it, there's also a lot of the whole concept of DAX where I can define a measure and reuse that in multiple dimension tables, right? So I can have, products and sum of the sales dollars and get that for products, or I can do it by salesperson. So that concept of I define the calculation and I apply the calculation to any dimension that I want, that comes out of MDX. So it's a merge of these 3 languages all in one area. Excel is a single point of data, SQL is row by row, and then MDX is defining functions and evaluating them across everything. So like there's 3 unique features of it, and I think those 3 features are what really makes DAX different than every other language out there because it relates to the business user and it relates to the heavy IT user.
I don't know why this really bizarre analogy came into my head, but I'm gonna go with it. DAX is like the siren, right? If you're not familiar, the siren is this mythical creature, that sang beautifully and lured sailors to their death, right?
Yep.
Man, it's gorgeous. It feels good, and you end up in a bad dark place real quick. Versus like my background is SQL, right?
Yep.
So like DAX was like that, right? Versus MDX and initial multidimensional cubes meant that was the sea witch. Like you knew you were going into battle before you even showed up. It was just like, man, that's ugly. That is something way wildly different than I'm used to. And you had to make a conscious choice to dive into the deep end.
Yep.
So with my background being SQL, it's another. It's like taking a new user and showing them group by. Select from this table and group by, and so that's simple. How easy DAX is.
Yep.
And then the next thing you teach them is CTEs and common table expressions and how to write a pivot table and stage data and variables. Like that's not the progression of how you teach somebody SQL.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, you ease them into things, and the challenge with DAX is it presents as very familiar and very easy. And I think when we started learning, there were also some larger challenges from the standpoint that the UI didn't show all the filter contexts,
Yep.
right? I can't
Yeah.
tell you how many times we actually had the right calculation and a page level filter was messing things up, right? Or because it was part of the report and there was no toggle to show all the other things impacting the table that you forgot about that were part of the other parts of the report. Just shoot me in the head, man.
Well,
and that's
you wonder why we ask or talk about filter context all the time? It's because we have nightmares.
well, and that's
Nightmares
also
about, like,
I would 100% agree with that, and that's probably one of the number one complaints for new people even consuming a report. Like, people will consume a report, apply a filter, and then click on something and be like, "There's no data. Data's gone. It's wrong. It's broken." Well, timeout. Tell me what your filter context was. What were you actually filtering down to, and how did you get to that answer? Because I think that's probably more your problem than my calculation's wrong.
And Seth,
and I would just to add one other point here, in terms of how I started, I started bashing my head against the wall, like much in the same way that I could work through SQL because I understood the data. You can't do that with DAX. You just doesn't work.
I think you raise an amazing point, Seth, where DAX is also your path to learning DAX is also the same path. You have to also learn a data model and a good structured data model too. They're dependent on one another. So just like you said, you might have the right formula, but if you have the wrong relationships, it's going to show you an output that's wrong. So you need to be able to have the right model and understand, like, oh, I can't do this because the model doesn't work that way. The relationship, the flow of the filters don't work that way. So even if let's say the functions you're using and the order that you're using it is technically correct, there are limitations if your model is not proper.
Sure. Right. The example I found online, it said this. But your model's different, man.
Right.
Like your relationship to make that work ain't there.
Yep.
Right.
Yes. Or I
right.
mean,
like that's a great point, Tommy. Like the foundational, like you think about the SQL backend, right? Like these are just tables of data and we interact in this language and it's all the same. It's not the same with the model. There's a whole other thing that has to be in place, for that one thing to work. It's a great point.
When I started Power BI, I did a lot of things or data manipulations inside Power Query. And now I'm doing a lot more in SQL because the data is at some point, the data gets large enough that M doesn't handle large data well enough yet.
Yes.
I think they're improving that, but there comes a point in time where the data becomes large enough, you got to do things in SQL. And what I found, I think initially when I was building out my DAX, and as I was learning it for me, was I was not spending enough time building proper tables and building proper relationships. So I was just kind of throwing in a table and said, okay, this links to here, we're done, we move on, and then I'll fix it all in DAX. And then sometimes you find in the DAX calculations, like there's a more complex way of aggregating things, or how you want the DAX and the visual to integrate together by clicking on things a certain way or having certain things highlight. You actually needed a different data model or different tables or aggregation tables or some other dimension. Or once you start getting your head around that, then you start seeing patterns like, okay, this is how I need to model this information. So you spend, adding flags on columns, date tables with like date indexes are super helpful. Like time intelligence is hard, but if you can have a date table that has date indexes, and that's something I have a couple blog posts around about how to build some tables that have these day, week, month, year indexes on things. It's much easier for you to say, day minus 3 days, and do a filtering. So I would do more work on the data model so I could just apply filters to information as opposed to having to write complex DAX to go grab a subset of information and then remove filters and then recalculate something. So I feel like that was another big learning point for me, is like your tables are not structured right.
Right. I need to hear what Seth says because
this conversation is not boding well for my excitement around natural language of DAX. Right? Because like this whole that is man, if they figure that out, how you'd have to be making recommendations to fix models.
Yep.
Yes.
Or what you're not going to come up with these like uber complex DAX expressions.
Yes.
Like the recommendation should be, you're missing this relationship, go fix it.
Yeah.
Yep.
That'll be interesting. I'll just move on.
I mean, it's funny. Is there a natural language for SQL? if you don't have that right now, that's
There's not.
widely available. I don't see how there's
Well,
going to be some.
let me.
That's another. I don't
But
want to get into
but
that.
it
We'll get into
Yes.
that
So
February
yeah,
2022.
there is though. So like there is there's automation in building SQL queries because right now even already in M you can use the UI, you can build certain things there, and it will query fold. So it is building some level of SQL for you, even though it's abstracted away from you. So it's not natural language. You don't just type in I want these things from this stuff, and in SQL just pops it out for you. But I think SQL it's not an easy challenge to solve. Let's just say that. I know it's not an easy challenge to solve. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
So I think this is all going to we're all kind of not skirting around it, but those mistakes that you had in the beginning of the learning curve when you kind of realized, okay, I need to invest more time into this. It's, to me, it was always like just a different business objective, or you may have even the basic, like you may have just a sub or an average, and you're creating a report and you put it into like, okay, now you're going to use this column to group by, and you're going to use this total, and it's showing the two numbers showing drastically different, and you have no idea why. And all you think in your head is just because there was that added extra step that the business asked you to do, you're like, if I just had Excel, this would be so much easier because I could just reference that one cell, but you can't. There's nothing you can do. So it's kind of like, okay, we kind of need a new structure. So
I agree with that.
So that's kind of when, for me, that was like, okay, we need to invest a lot of time in this because this finally gets into everyone's favorite, and it's the evaluation context. So, and again, a model. If you have a cross filter, bidirectional relationship, that can drastically affect the output of what the data is going to show. Not necessarily the DAX formula, but the output.
I would agree with that 100%. And I would say, particularly in my DAX world, right? So let's talk about some of our early learning. So for listeners who are kind of just jumping on and they're just kind of getting at this for their first time, right? What were some of the resources that you guys used to kind of initially get your feet wet or get your sound footing on some of the DAX concepts? So I'll go with one of mine. Definitely was the Rob Colley book. Rob Colley's book around it's called Power Pivot and Power BI. Now this is more of a I think there's a lot of two things I loved about this book. Rob is hilarious. There's a ton of Star Wars and nerdy jokes in it throughout the whole thing, and I thought this is just I was literally laughing at this book, thinking this is an enjoyable read, and it's about data, and I love that too. So like that was one of the things I thought was very very cool about the book. So I'll put a link for that one in here in the chat window for those of you who haven't got it. This would be 100%. If you're newer to DAX, go buy this book, put it on your shelf, read through it. I think it's a must-have. It's a great basis for what I was doing coming from Excel and coming into Power BI and DAX. That was one of mine.
Yeah, if we're talking books, the first one I picked up was probably Phil's, because Phil also comes from the SQL background.
Oh, that's a good point too. Yes, got it here.
So he had the beginning guide or learning to DAX. That was extremely helpful in breaking down some of the basic concepts.
Yep.
I hesitate to say this, but like the other way is like the community. If you want examples of what people are doing and the types of questions that they have, I think the one area they did a really, really good job of is the community around searches and filtering and finding relevant topics that are answered. That I would highly recommend if you want to learn all of the examples that are out there and see different solutions. It's a great place. Don't expect to go there all the time and get your answer though, because to the point that was just made, your model, your data, it could be completely shaped differently and it may not work, which is why you need to test things out in your own sandbox. But for working solutions and finding people and problem sets that are very similar to you, not only are you potentially answering your question, you're learning a lot of other things along the way.
Yeah, and Seth, I absolutely love that point, because I think one of the things with DAX, the only way you can really learn and truly move forward is of doing it yourself, or having a scenario and then trying to accomplish it. Again, because the formula, the functions themselves are pretty straightforward, but how everything works together. Back in the day, I had basically, you can actually set up an RSS feed on community for the different forums,
Mm-hmm.
and you can say, I only want to, only give me ones that have been answered. And I would just run through those, any answered
That's a good
topic.
technique. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you just go through it. And again, even if it doesn't apply to your particular model,
Yep.
if it's something similar, there's so many times you go, I didn't know you can apply that together. Like I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
And it's just learning all the ways that you can apply the language. Like how can you use calculate and what scenarios? And to me, that was some of the biggest inspiration. And then even if it's not directly tied to your model, it may give you that idea like, well, let me just try that, and try to apply that new way of doing it and just see what the output is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of experimentation.
I like that one a lot.
I actually learned the most DAX while on the community because I found myself not being able to answer a lot of those questions. And I was a heavy community contributor around administration and all the other aspects, but that was like I dove deep into all those, the same thing, right? Find all the answered questions and just read through them.
Yeah.
But it's learning by doing in some way, shape, or form.
I'd agree with that.
For sure.
So I'll throw another one in here that I felt was another pivotal moment in me learning DAX was this concept of in a calculated column, I could write a DAX statement and see what it was evaluating on every single row of piece of data, right? So it was a row by row context. When I started using a bit more of DAX Studio, and DAX Studio has a little bit of a slightly different language and how you write DAX. You have to use an evaluate statement and some other things. So that's something you have to see, or how you have to basically write it a little bit differently than you normally would your normal DAX. And DAX Studio only returns tables. You can't return a single value. So there's a little bit of a syntax difference. However, you can return tables of information. You can write a DAX statement and return a table. And I think for me, there's a moment here, and now you can also do that in Tabular Editor. I don't know if you can do it in 2, but I know you can do it in 3. But where you can evaluate a DAX statement and it says, I'm going to return a list of values of whatever you produced. So for me, sometimes when I'm building DAX statements, there's this idea of I need to be able to produce a list of things and then I need to sum that list, or I'm aggregating something and then filtering out some stuff. So I need to go through step by step. I need to see what was the table of products I wanted.
Yes.
And then apply a calculation to them and then see the products by numbers, like the numbers for each product, and then apply an aggregate statement on top of that. So when I'm doing these, I'll call them virtual tables inside a DAX statement. You need them. Sometimes you need a dynamic list of summarize for what you're trying to calculate. And again, that kind of comes up higher up the filter context area of your learning DAX. But for me, learning to use DAX Studio is helpful, and Tabular Editor, where I could write a single statement and return a list of values and get those answers out. Also around the same time is when I started using variables. And I think variables were also very key for me because, one, it made my DAX way more performant. There's a lot of misses. When I look at new people's DAX, they're not using variables, and they're calling the same function multiple times in a statement, which is causing the evaluation statement of that. Let's say I'm doing sum of sales. If you drop sum of sales in the true false statement of the if statement and add it as the true portion in the if statement. So if sales is above 1,000, then return sum of sales. If that's what you're doing, you're actually evaluating the sum of sales twice. And so variables reduce that and remove that away from that calculation. So variables for me helped out a lot, and for debugging. So when I'm debugging DAX, I would write a variable and I would output very small pieces of my DAX formula until I got it right. And then I would then merge them all together, and then I would be able to figure out what I was doing or producing. So I think those would be two kind of other key observations I needed to learn was DAX Studio, and then figuring out how to make virtual tables and be able to kind of pick apart my DAX, debugging it with variables.
So Rob Colley actually had a great article years ago, and it was basically for if you have a complex measure that you have to create or a complicated form you have to write, he said, break it down. Like start off by basically making individual measures. So I just had this last week where it was basically like I needed to pull the previous month complete, wherever the previous month's complete data was, and then pull 12 months before that, not including that complete month. So what I did was I just started like, okay, I want to grab the latest day. So basic credit measure just to say, what does that output look like?
Yep.
Because again, with variables, it also stores that output in that because it's calculated within that variable, not within the return.
Yep,
Which is
exactly.
again very powerful.
Yes.
So then that's a huge way, because if you need to do something where you're doing a time intelligence or the last 30 days, do a measure that shows you if you're trying to get the 30 days, 30 days ago,
Yep.
write something that returns your first day. Does
Yep.
it return what you expected?
Yep, exactly.
So,
Yeah,
but yeah,
I think you mentioned it in there, but when you're using variables, like you can return the variable and just comment out the other
Yep.
sections.
Yeah.
Right?
You don't even have to
The
comment
nice
it.
thing about that measure, right? The nice thing about that measure is you can call those specific things as you're building them
Yes.
and return them before you do the final calculation.
The final calculation.
I've missed your voices. It's been a while.
I know. That's the first one.
Yeah.
That just sounded like it was going to fit right there. So
the other thing I would definitely recommend, because I wish I would have started solving my problems that way, is a process we talk about, Mike, a lot, which is using a table, right? So use a build from a very simple data set.
Yes,
first.
I 100%
right?
agree with this one.
Take out all of the challenges of like your big data set. Make a 5-row table with the data that represents it. What I would say that we haven't said before is capture the state of what you want to see, right? Like,
yes,
have the data. What is the output? Because when we're talking about DAX, it's like, I want to see this number. Well, let's ensure that the number you want to see is the simple calculation of this or whatever. And then you'll have like that. I know what I want to hit kind of in your mind's eye, and then use a table.
Yep.
And then you're taking out a ton of the complexity that comes up with randomness in a data set, the things that like could pop up that are potentially valid, or a scenario that you don't understand. And then you're solving the formula problem or the function instead of having other things thrown into that just create larger challenges to solve for.
Average Nerd Dad has a great point on this. He goes, Excel is excellent for making mock data like this. And I would also agree.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as you have like the date fields, and sometimes I've even done stuff where I know there's challenges in the data, and there's like a problem. Like the data's the wrong format or the wrong type, and I'm filtering
missing a month.
I'm missing a month maybe, and I will make like a 100-row mini table, and my favorite function in Excel for doing this is rand between, because I can say random between a start number and an end number, and I'll just pile in a bunch of just random stuff. And when I was doing this very heavily for debugging DAX, I think early on, I was building a lot of these little simple tables, and I did it. I'm a big fan of doing two things for two reasons. Like, if you do anything, you need to have two reasons for it. And a lot of my early blogs, you'll see a lot of these examples around me doing exploration in DAX, because I'm building these little tiny models of these little sample data sets where I'm learning how to do DAX, but I've made a sample representative thing that's not the actual data, so I could go share it on a blog. So I would spend time learning those things, and that would then be the initial production of, here's my data set, here's my setup. And so a lot of my initial blogs are, here's the data, I'm going to just give it to you, here's how we're going to solve that problem.
And the thing I really like about using this table concept is, if I'm not wrong, Tabular Editor includes that now as part of when you're creating calculations, right? Shows you what the table breakout of that calculation is before you push it into a model.
You can do like a pivot grid, something like that. So, but you have to save it back to the model first.
Similar.
It's similar.
Right?
I have to test that exactly. So I know. So the pivot grid. So two things that Tabulator is doing now that I think is awesome. You can go inspect a table. So you can just say show table on the left-hand side of the nav bar. So you can see all the data that makes up a table in DAX Studio, which I think that was one of the things I was missing in Tabular Editor 2, was because I had a model there. I needed to really see like what the table was doing, so I could visualize the data that's in those columns. The second thing is a pivot grid. So in the pivot grid, it's basically like a matrix where you drop dimensions on the left-hand side, and then you can add measures in the table, like you described, Seth, and then it will evaluate those measures directly into basically a pivot table, and then you can filter on top of it too. So I can make a grid and filter on top of it.
Yeah.
So I'm actually amazed that this far into this conversation, but just because I do agree with the examples, the scenarios, but I'm amazed that this far in the conversation, we haven't talked about learning or that introduction to filter context and evaluation context.
Oh, that's a good
Because
point.
that,
Yeah.
so by far, the biggest point for me, I think, where you would say where's the top of the mountain of learning was Marco Russo's Definite Guide to DAX,
Oh, yeah.
first edition. So when it first came out, because he had, I think, 3 chapters, like introduction to evaluation context, introduction to calculate,
Yep.
and he explicitly said in the beginning, this is not a easy read. This is not something you're going to just breeze through and go to the next chapter. Bookmark this and refer back to it. I
Yes.
remember the point in my learning path where it just was more or less required, and I just we're newly married, but I told my wife, I'm like,
You and
give me
Marco?
2 weekends. Russo, what?
No. You said you were newly married.
Oh,
You're just talking about Marco Russo. So I was teasing you.
oh,
No, you were newly married with your wife, and you were learning about
I'm not
Marco
quick enough.
Russo
I
at the
would have had a
time.
better joke. I thought of
Oh
something, but I'm
man.
like, that wouldn't be fun. Yeah, so if I was quicker, that would have been able to respond to that. But to my lovely wife, who's not listening, but I said, I'm like, I need 2 weekends, 2 Saturdays and Sundays, and I'm like, I just need to read this book, and I need to
Yeah.
go through. And I went through it so slowly. I went back to it because this is the mindset. This is the thing where more probably for most of us, we've never had to think this way, and not just in business, but in general about filter context. And
Mhm.
it's a very different way of approaching a problem and a very different way of approaching an output, and especially if you're coming from Excel. So trying to highlight this part of the book, read through it,
Yep.
and then try to apply that. This was the biggest milestone. So it's not something you start out with DAX, but as you begin to have situations where this is going to be required, or you're beginning not to get output that you're expecting.
Yep.
This is, once that starts happening, that's probably a very good time to begin to introduce yourself to how evaluation contexts work, when it's applied, and how to understand it.
So the SQL BI stuff is top notch. Their blogs are top notch. You have to read them slowly. They're very thorough, and so when I was initially learning Power BI and particularly DAX, I could not handle SQL BI initially. I really couldn't. I'd read it and I wouldn't understand it, and I would get lost in it, and I didn't understand what was going on. Now that I have been much more into DAX now, makes much more sense. And I think, Tommy, you made a great point there around filter context. Filter context is so paramount because it's filter context on the filter pane, which is driving filter context. It's filter context in the visual. I can see the dimensions, and that's the filter context for the single data point calculation. And now I can have filter context inside the DAX measure itself. So if there's filter context all over the place, and just understanding what is filtering your data, it's basically adding. And in my world was like, DAX is basically a very fancy way of adding where clauses on all your calculations. I'm doing a count or a sum of some value, and I'm just modifying the where clause like crazy because I'm filtering all kinds of crazy stuff in here. So for me, that was how I related DAX back to SQL, was like, oh my gosh, I wanted to build in Power BI more than I wanted to write SQL statements, because every time I had to write a SQL statement, I had to select the doggone columns and then say from this table and then do the where statement. And then I had, where date equals this or range. Like, I was like, forget this. I'll just go to Power BI, connect to the table, and I'll just drag things on a page. And I'd have like 7 or 8 visuals that all had different filter contexts. And it was like I had 9 or 10 SQL statements written in like a second or two. Like, it was super fast. And I was like, this is the way to go. I love this. So I really like the experience of that, because it really helped me comb through data much quicker than I felt like writing individually handwritten measures or calculate or SQL statements as well. So that where statement was applied everywhere.
Yeah, that is bar none still why the tabular model and DAX and these methods are so powerful.
Yeah.
Is not only just the data sets, but just what you outlined, Mike.
Yeah.
Right. We had to manually build all of these aggregation tables behind the scenes to produce these metrics. all the time.
Yeah.
And that's why reporting took a long time, because you're pre-aggregating all of these things into a calculation
Yep.
that you then throw in reporting services.
Yep.
And now you have an interface where it's like, no man, like
Drag
this
drop.
thing just understands the
Yep.
drag and drop and
Yeah.
automatically applies those contexts. And that's the challenge behind it.
Clicky,
I would
clicky,
say
draggy, droppy.
clicky, draggy, droppy. The recommendation I would have for people that are learning DAX or in the mix right after getting up and running with the sum and being smacked in the face is take the time to just read through filter context, right, of some sort. There's plenty of, go to SQL BI, go to, understand at least the concept of all of the things that could change. Break it down into the basics when you're developing a calculation. Utilize the resources that are out there for, from a community perspective, and just practice. Like DAX is one of those things you just have to do. Don't try to go find the answer. Try to find what the calculation, understand the language and understand what each of these keywords is doing around grouping or returning or adding conditions depending on how complex the calculation gets. And we've touched on it a little bit, but the more time you spend in your model and your modeling, the less complex your DAX is going to be.
Yeah, agreed.
So,
and you might shape your tables differently based on that knowledge, right? You might actually build a couple, and this is the same thing you do in SQL. You'll add a key or you'll add a column that's a flag on or off, or is current or is not current.
Right.
Like you can add things into your, like if you know you're going to be selecting things by certain date ranges, like if 30 days is a thing or the last month, like yes, there are DAX functions that do that, but if you use a date table, you enhance your date table a little bit more. And something here I think that is different is in the DAX world, when you refresh your data model, all the tables are refreshed unless you're doing something very custom. So if you're building a date table and you hit refresh in the data model, it's very easy for you to pick up, this is the current day. Today, here's the context of today, and you can basically use that to drive new calculated columns that build these dynamic rolling indexes for dates and time. So I find that that's very helpful, and that's different than how you're used to doing it in SQL, because in SQL you'd had to do, it was a static date table. You'd build a date table for the last 10 years or the next 10 years, whatever that is, and that's the table you would use for everything. And so in this DAX world, you can actually have that table be a little bit more fluid and change over time to meet your needs of the reporting, which I think is kind of a unique thing for the tabular model in general.
Yeah, Seth, I'll kind of follow up what you were saying as well when it comes to look at the samples. You have to do it. I highly recommend from the community forum to especially every article that's on SQL BI, they always have a sample file. And a lot of people who actually write or are pretty prominent with their blogs, they always have a sample file. Download them. Have a folder on your OneDrive or wherever you want and call it Sandbox.
Yep.
Whatever you want to call it, but save all these sample files there and just look what they're doing. And again, some things you might never be aware of or can do because of your model doesn't have that necessary structure, but odds are you'll kind of run into that situation at some point. So actually looking at the model and then trying to interact with, okay, if I apply this filter, I see why, Marco Russo does a great job of usually showing the wrong way, the okay way, and the right way.
Correct.
And and so just going through that,
or that you could do this.
You could do this, but don't add a filter. Like just don't add date, year, kind of, or you'll break everything. So but going through those situations is, to me, probably the best way. And again, the forum too, because you'll go through the community site and someone's like, oh, you can do this, and something you never thought of. You're like, well, let me just try this. I also recommend having a sample database or sample data model that kind of all encompass scenarios for you, so you can kind of test things out on.
Great lead in, Tommy. I want to jump in that one right there. So that's a great point. Yes. So I want to point out DAX.do for that sample data set. So this is again another SQL BI tool that's out there. It's absolutely amazing. What you can do in here is you can write DAX statements, or you can do basically tabular editor level, or DAX Studio level statements in this environment that shows you how things work. And the tables that they've built a data model that has some tables in it, and it has basically enough information in that data set that it supports all of their evaluations for DAX.guide. So another great website for learning things. These are newer tools that have been recently published. Is DAX.guide. What DAX.guide is by far the most comprehensive library of functions and how they work. It also links to the SQL BI articles that teach you how to do it. And then there are usually try it out, and you have a try it button where you can take that DAX code and you can flip it over into DAX.do, which is that real-time editor. You don't have to build anything. You can just use it as an example or a playground for you to build DAX statements, and then you can see their code. And for me, where learning happens is taking some existing code and slightly modifying it to meet my needs. And so I love DAX.guide because I use it all the time. Super helpful. And you'll also notice when you use Tabular Editor 3, anytime you have a function, you can actually define that function, and that function will hot link you to the DAX.guide language and documentation. So that tool will take you directly to like the source of information for this. And it tells you, when was this function introduced? Which analysis services models does it run on? Is it in Power BI or Excel? Like, it gives you all the things that you need to know about, even because some functions are newer and they're coming out more recently. So if you're not on a current data model, your function will not work. So anyways.
Where was this 5 years ago?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
I think about like
Totally.
This conversation is so cool for people who are just getting into it because the
way
wealth
better.
of information.
Yeah.
I mean, you say Power BI and the community and all of these people.
Yeah.
That have been contributing. Just there's so much more information out there, which is fantastic, and tools to do that, like that you just outlined. So,
but these were not even around like weeks, like years ago. Like it was not there. You didn't have the ability.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like now it's much better coming into it.
Yeah.
Like you give a lot more resources that are
I agree.
at your disposal.
I totally agree with that one. Another series that I'll also point out real quick on YouTube. Kerbal has done like a DAX Fridays. So the videos are a little bit longer. To me, there's a little too much lead up in some of them, but she does go through some really good examples as well. I'll try and put the link in there as well. But she does a really good job on DAX Fridays. Here's the function. We're going to walk through this, and I'm going to kind of go through a quick little example here as well. So that's another YouTube channel that I watch and follow.
Well, SQL BI is doing these 5-minute videos now that are
also
unplugged, I think.
Yeah.
Is that what it's? Yeah.
Well, they do that, and they do like little sections around like here's a little trick, and like so you could tell like a lot of people
breaking it down into chunks now.
Yeah, they're breaking it down into chunks.
Digestible pieces.
Yes, exactly. It's for the layman's like me.
For us simpletons.
Right.
Wait, back up. What was that sentence? Like,
pause.
I can't. That documentation, like, man, I just sentence to sentence, I'd get lost.
Yeah.
Like, what?
Let's make sure I understand what they're talking about.
Great stuff. Yeah. It's like reading good philosophy or something like that. Right?
Exactly. Ponder this one. Anyways, cool. So with this, I think we've done a pretty good job. We've given a lot of examples around things that we've learned. I think we've kind of gone through how do we start out and where we're at now. And so, let's, as our final recommendation, kind of just wrap things up here. I think my word of advice would be, get yourself familiar with a couple of these books. Start out with some, if you're coming from an Excel world, I recommend Rob Colley's book. If you're coming from the SQL world, I'd recommend Phil Seamark's book. If you are more advanced in your DAX journey, jump in and start looking at the SQL BI stuff. And you'll probably find some value at the beginner levels with SQL BI, but it may go over your head initially. Don't worry. It'll come as you spend time in it. So that would be, get in, read those things, and start just, testing things out. That would be my recommendation. Practice.
Do, read and do. DAX is one of the DAX.do. Mm-hmm. That's actually perfectly named.
Yeah.
Go do it.
Yep.
Write the calculations. Practice.
So my recommendation, just wait till February 2022 when
yes,
you'll be fine. So
you won't have to know it anymore.
Yeah.
It'll be done.
Well, we didn't even mention another great. If you want examples, if you want scenarios, DAX.patterns. We didn't even mension that.
Oh yeah.
Or I think it's DAX.patterns. It's been out there for a while, but that is some rich information, and those are long articles. But download the file and like ABC analysis or the customer first returning customers.
Yep.
Those scenarios can be so complex in DAX, but actually getting the data model and the file, that's huge. So just what you guys said, practice. Dedicate some time if you know you have to try something out or learn something. 2 hours or after work or during work to actually DAXpatterns.com.
I'd agree with that 100%.
But because you're going to need that time, but it's going to be practice and going through scenarios.
Awesome. All right, Tommy.
Once you get it though, man.
With that, how can people find the podcast? How can you engage with us?
So you can engage a few ways. The podcast is available on all podcast platforms. If you want to join the conversation, if you're listening to the episode and not YouTube, we do the live stream every Tuesday and Thursday morning, 7:30 a.m. Central. Just go to Power BI Tips YouTube channel to find the future episodes. If you want to join the conversation, suggest a topic for us to talk about in the future, 2 ways, powerbi.tips/explicit measures podcast. I'm losing my ability to speak.
I'm going to shorten that at some point.
Yes.
I will get you like an easy.
That may be a good idea.
I will get you an easy link here at some point.
And then at the very bottom of that, there is a form to submit or mention Power BI tips on Twitter with the hashtag EMP mailbag.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I thought this was really good. I hope this helps out some people who are starting out with DAX, or we maybe thrown out a couple books or some resources you haven't heard of. We hope that you find some value in those. And we'll see you again next week on Tuesday. Take care, guys.